Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Zena Suisa, President of Residence Executive and Team Coaching. We offer services in coaching, training. I'm a consultant, and also we offer many workshops. Just look it up. You'll see it on the slides. I'd love to introduce my guest today. I'm going to be interviewing David Burkus, who's an amazing person who I was just talking to just prior to recording. And with your permission, David, if I can talk a little bit about you.
Yeah, no, please. Thank you so much for having me. First off, let me say that.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, David is a best-selling author, keynote speaker, former business school professor. He's delivered keynotes to the leaders of Fortune 500 companies, such as Microsoft, Google, Stryker, government and military leaders at the U.S. Naval Academy and Naval Postgraduate School. His TED Talks has viewed over 2 million times. That's great. And he's a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review. He's the author of Under New Management. You can see it right here. Buy it, people. This is a good book. It's a really good book. He's also written The Myths of Creativity, and his new book, which I promised to get, Friend of a Friend, which offers readers a new perspective on how to grow networks and build key connections. Hi, David.
How are you doing? Again, thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to talk to you.
I'm excited to talk to you. You brought me back in time, and I mentioned a little bit, but I'll tell you why. I taught at McGill for many years, and I taught in that. I'm a psychologist that taught in management because that's the direction I go. I like to cross the line a little bit. And I taught organizational behavior and managing organizational teams. When teaching organizational behavior, what comes up? Frederick Taylor, of course. Scientific management movement. We've got the founder of scientific management movement. He's the father of the productive management. And his belief is speed and efficiency will lead to productivity. Who do I think of? My late dad. My father was an immigrant from Russia, and his father had a fur design house, so they did quite well. Comes to Canada, Montreal, and what does he do? He works in a factory. And everything is the boss said and the boss did, and we've got to do that. We've got to work faster. And even as a child, I thought to myself, if you work faster, well, you have a good machine to work with. Like, if somebody else is better than yours, maybe you're working faster. So even as a kid, I started seeing speed and efficiency doesn't always work. And I love your book, David, because you challenge the system. You don't maintain the status quo. You look at many, many areas. I picked just a couple of areas in the workplace, and you challenge it, the assumptions, traditions. And I'd like to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Why do people resist change? What is it about people that they don't like change?
Yeah. Well, so I have to say too, if you were teaching at McGill for a long time, I mean, that's home of some intellectual heroes of mine. Henry Mintzberg is probably before me, the person that is, he's probably the one that figured out that like the spreadsheet is really just the new stopwatch for Taylorism, right? And we need actual managers. Carl Moore, I think, is still there. He's a good friend of mine and a brilliant thinker. And probably they have a number of different things to say about change too. I really think, from a psychological angle, I think the biggest resistor to change is that loss aversion piece. We know from so many studies that people overemphasize when they're doing the calculations in their mind, they overemphasize what they could stand to lose and underemphasize what they could gain. And to be fair, I think leaders almost play to this by talking about what needs to change as in what needs to go away. Yes. And that heightens that loss aversion instead of pointing out this is where we're headed. I think when you're trying to sell change, you need to be constantly selling what's to be gained and minimizing those losses and changes. Yes, you need to acknowledge them, but people are already going to maximize those. Right. So to the extent that you can get people refocused on where we're headed and what we gain for that, you counteract that loss aversion piece. And I really think that's the biggest one. Even you look at managers not wanting to update their systems and that sort of thing. It's all because they're thinking about, well, if I accept this change, here's what I will lose. Maybe it's status, maybe it's just comfort. And that is what prevents them a lot of times from doing that.
Your book, and I have to bring you in a little bit a different area. Your book, what caught my eye was the quote by Gary Hamel, which I know who he is, not personally, but I know who he is. The quote, it's, if human beings could invent the modern industrial organization, then they can reinvent it. And that speaks to your book.
Yeah. And when I should say that I'm indebted to Gary a lot, like I kind of look at, Under New Management came out in 2016. Gary's The Future of Management came out in sort of early 2000s. And that was really kind of my template was wanting to do almost a follow-up to that. Okay, Gary did a great job pointing out this is where companies were headed in the early 2000s and the research behind why it's a good idea, but it's been 15 years. Where are we now? Even more of the workforce in North America, especially, has shifted from industrial to knowledge to a creative economy. So there are even bigger changes that have to go out. So I had to throw the quote in. I love that you caught it, because that was his thesis then, and I still believe it, right? We're in an era where the biggest asset to me is problem solving, creativity, the ability to innovate. And we've already done that. That's how we got to the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. We just need to take a deep look at those systems that we created then and figure out what are we going to innovate moving forward.
So let's reinvent, because that's what you're talking about, reinventing. Email. Like email is like Facebook, like Instagram and Twitter, and nobody stops with this. It's inundating, and it's, you claim it's like detrimental to productivity.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not my claim. There's a ton of research on it, right? Yeah. I mean, email. So to go back, like email, we forget about this. But email is like a 50-year-old technology. We like to think about it like it's this new thing, right? But you know, late 60s, early 70s on DARPANet, we were exchanging messages, right? It probably, I mean, I came of age in the era of America Online, and you sign in and like only half the time would it tell you you've got mail, and it'd be really exciting. And now, of course, like we just count on our inboxes being inundated with stuff. And the challenge is that, like, the amazing thing about the technology is that it's cheap. It costs basically nothing to send after you set it up. And it's asynchronous, right? Which means you can have a conversation that you don't need two people in a room. It can happen at any hour. Yeah. The problem is it's cheap, so we send way too much of it, and it's asynchronous, so we send it whenever the heck we want. And both of those things have a detrimental effect on productivity. When it's during work hours, it can become a constant source of distraction, right? And in some studies, every like 44, 45 seconds, you're hearing that ping, and you're moving to that. And we know from the research that it takes 5 to 10 minutes. If you're in deep thinking work, you're doing focused work, and you get distracted, it takes 5 to 10 minutes to get back to that level of focus. So do the math, right? You're getting distracted every minute. It takes 5 minutes to get back. You never got focused. And that's why you have those days where you think like, oh, I had a really productive day today, because you have no emails in your inbox, but you didn't actually do anything that created value. None, right? And then after hours, it's a similar story, but possibly even more detrimental, because now we're pulling people away from their recharge time, from their family time. And if you're that, I get it, everybody's in a different stage. What happens in a lot of organizations is we've got that manager or senior leader who they are more flexible with the hours they work. Maybe their kids are grown and out of the house, so they don't mind sending an email at 7:30, 8:30 at night. But then you've got those younger workers who are trying to balance work and family, trying to figure it all out. And they're getting this subtle message that like, nope, we're a 24/7 culture. And even if you say as a leader that you want work-life balance, that you want people to sort of respect those boundaries, if you're sending emails at 11 o'clock at night, you are saying a much bigger message by clicking send on that than anything else about what your culture should be like. And that can be equally detrimental. One of my favorite studies, and it's not a peer-reviewed, placebo-controlled type of study, but it was an internal experiment that McKinsey and Company did, forcing their junior consultants, their analysts and those sort of people, the most overworked people, to take one night off a week. Everybody took a different night off. They thought there'd be huge sort of productivity diminishes because it was this sort of high-performance culture. And in reality, there were huge gains because people could actually get the recharge time that they needed. Time away from work makes work better. And I think email is the biggest thing that's pulling people back into being at work at all hours. And that's a huge problem.
You're right. And this email, we're sitting at dinner and everybody's got their phone out and everybody's checking their email and, not attending to people. And you're right. It's really, even young people. And, sitting in a classroom, students sitting in a classroom, checking their email and their Facebook page. I have to mention Facebook page, of course, it's not productive.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite is like the people that say, oh, no, but I take notes on my phone. Well, get a pen and paper, because the research shows it's better to take notes there anyway.
Oh, you're my kind of guy. Take the notes. That's how you learn. The brain reads what your head writes. And it's true. It's true. So another thing that you discussed in your book is pay secrecy. Like, should your pay be secret? Now, I worked in an educational system. Everybody knows your pay because more or less everybody gets about the same amount of pay, you know? But in the workplace, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so this was, I would say this was a hill I was expecting to die on when the book came out, but I was not expecting it to be as sort of visceral. I get two types of email from people that like watch the TED Talk on pay transparency or what have you. And some of them are your situation. They're like, I've been a police officer for 20 years. Everybody knows I get paid. I work for a state education system. Everybody knows I get. What's the big deal? That's that crew. But I get way more people that are like, this is private information. This is between an employee and the employer, and that's it. That's the only party. And like, never mind that if it's a publicly traded company, then technically there are much more invested parties than that. But regardless, right? So I wasn't expecting this sort of visceral reaction, but I do get it, right? We, especially in North America and in most of the West, not all places in Europe, et cetera, but let's just say the West, we're very, very secretive about pay. And when we're not, there are uproars. There are, oh, I can't believe there's this gap in wages, or I can't believe this person is overpaid. And we've never taken the time to realize that, like, maybe the reason we are so frustrated with and get so angry when pay gets revealed isn't that revealing pay is a bad thing. It's that secrecy allows a lot of discrepancies to happen, right? And so the thing about pay transparency, we know from research, both in studies and in vivo, with workers, that when people know how everyone's getting paid and they know and trust the system to be fair, then they're more engaged, they're more likely to work hard. When they know how they can make more money, they're more likely to work hard to make more money. So there are all sorts of gains. The problem, and I get it, is that a lot of organizations, because they default to secrecy, also don't have to worry about making pay fair, right? So if you're a company, like, my biggest piece of advice is not let's reveal what everybody gets paid. My biggest piece of advice is if you do an internal survey and you find that your company's pay system is unfair, by God, don't be transparent. That's the worst possible thing you could do. Fix the problem first, then be transparent, right? But honestly, I mean, most HR representatives, chief HR officers, or even just HR generalists that I talk to, most organizations are striving for a fair pay system. So why would you keep the secrecy element, which lets people still sort of guess and make manipulations? The example I always use is like, oh, we see that so-and-so just showed up with a new BMW 5 Series. Clearly he's overpaid. It's 2019. Maybe his wife's a doctor. Right? Like, you can't, we make all those little judges, and we do it in a secrecy condition. If we have a transparent condition, which can be everything from just letting people know here's how we assign salaries, but not doing personal level data, to letting everybody know what everybody gets paid. And anywhere in that continuum increases the level of trust that employees have, because they can see very clearly with bold underlined letters that this is the system and it's fair. And if it's not fair, I can bring it up. I work in a culture where it's okay to challenge that. But when you go, nope, nobody talk about it, you end up allowing the perception of unfairness to linger, even if you have a fair pay system.
This is a great mindset to have, but I don't think we're there yet. Would you agree?
The last data that I saw, so 2016, the book came out. I was looking at data for 2018. We're at about 12 to 14% of for-profit companies being transparent. So yeah, we're not there yet. And by the way, I don't think that we're going to get to a place where 100% of companies are posting their employees and salaries online. What I would love is a place where the majority of companies say, you know what, the issue of pay is so important. Here is the formula we use. We're not going to tell you who got paid what, but you can at least see, hey, I was offered 75 grand a year and I know why. And that's enough for me.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that. Then you touched on an area. Remember, there's many areas in your book. I just touched on several. I think that impacted me. I also taught, as I mentioned, managing organizational teams. And you mentioned that for hiring, it's not the individual leader, executive, whoever, manager that hires. It should be the team that hires. And I have to agree with you, because a team is made up of people with different resources, strengths, weaknesses. So why should the person's going to have to work with a team? Why is the individual hiring them? What are your
well, I mean, I think I think a lot of times managers suffer from a Lake Wobegon effect about their talent spotting abilities, right? The majority of them think they're above average hirers. I mean, we know, I mean, there's tons of research on this that we know that like the job interview, just the normal come in, spend an hour with the hiring manager. If you make the cut, maybe you come back and it's the manager and her boss, right? And that's it. And it's basically like, I've actually compared it to like, it's like speed dating. It's like 4 rounds of speed dating. And then we make a life-altering decision. We choose to hire that person and spend 40 plus hours a week with that person in our organization. Let that person represent our organization to customers in some cases, based off of 2.5 hours, you know, four rounds of interviews with people, maybe, right? And this is not all companies. Some companies have done an amazing job creating a hiring system that, even though it's not involving the team, is still objective. But my goal was to say that, you know what, the easiest way to know if somebody's going to be a performance fit, if they're going to be a culture fit, et cetera, is to let the people who are about to work with this person decide who that person is. The other thing, beyond just the sort of Lake Wobegon effect of interviews that we have, the other reason I think is we're still in a very individualistic culture where we think that talent is the result of an individual. And that's quite simply not the case in a knowledge work economy. And by the way, it wasn't the case in an industrial economy either. When we were running factories in Taylor's age, like the ability to keep the line running still depended on everyone working in time. So even then, the overall outcome was a team-based metric. But even now, I mean, we have people who think, I mean, we're in an age where we're paying dearly for talent in, so let's say, in finance or in tech. We're paying for people who can code, but then they're working with teams of 50, 60, sometimes 100 people to create a product. That the overall outcome is dependent on teams. It's not dependent on an individual. So that's the other sort of mindset shift that I think needs to happen, is that if even individual performance is a result of team talent, then why aren't we considering that team fit to begin with?
The fact that you're saying, why are we not considering it, is saying that we're still not considering it.
Yeah, no, and we're not. I mean, again, I give talks all over the world, and when I make the jokes about speed dating and the one, pretty much everybody has the same process. The funniest to me, actually, is I give a lot of talks these days to entrepreneurs, small business owners, people who left corporate America because it drove them nuts. And then they started a company, and as soon as it got big enough to where they needed to have talent, they almost like, I don't know what to do. So they just mimicked the talent hiring process of the company that they left. And like, you don't think that that's just going to create the same problems that drove you nuts and drove you to start your own business to begin with?
It maintains the status quo, and there is no change. And with this one, I totally agree with you. So let's start a revolution. We're going to have team hirings. When you started talking about speed dating, that's funny. That's so true.
Oh, no, it really, I mean, and again, we knew 20 years ago that unstructured interviews were a terrible predictor of performance, but we're still not, even when we're doing the one-on-one interviews, the majority of them are still not structured interviews, which work a little bit better. We're not doing any sort of, most of the time, we're not doing any sort of assessment or testing going on, any sort of in-person. Like my biggest, and this is in the hiring teams chapter, my biggest advice for a lot of places is figure out how you can run trials, figure out how you can hire on a temporary basis. And then when somebody has proven themselves, bring them into that sort of full-time thing. It's really odd to me, the systems where, candidly, it's really odd to me when you look at academia and you see that they're doing something better, because it's not normally doing things better than a for-profit organization, but talent is definitely one of them. There's a reason that we have tenure track, not immediate tenure. There's a reason that people spend 2 or 3 years, both on the research, on the teaching side, knowing that we're going to be watching to see how good of a fit they are before we make the permanent decision. And that's a far better way to do it, even if it's not 2 or 3 years, even if it's a couple months. It's a far better way to do it with talent in all shapes and sizes. Before we make that decision of giving you sort of all of that permanence, we need to know that you're a fit. Because again, like, and I talk about this a bit in the book, it comes down to what kind of culture that you want to build. If you say that our performance standard is here, and then you're doing this individual thing, and then because the manager doesn't want to admit that he or she made a mistake, we're letting a performer who only rises to this level stay, then your performance level's here. You could say it's here, but you're lying to yourself,
Yeah.
right? And the only way that we keep that level of performance up here is if we get everyone involved in making the decision, but also everyone involved in keeping each other accountable. Business runs on teams, and so all elements of choosing who joins the business should too.
Business runs on teams, but I'll tell you, teaching, working with teams, I love working with teams, by the way, it's so difficult. It is so difficult.
Yeah.
So difficult.
I mean, business is always going to be about humans. One day we might have algorithms buying stuff from other algorithms, but as long as it's about humans, you're going to have human problems. You're going to have personality problems, etc. There's no avoiding them. The hope is that we can minimize them by seeing ahead of time where the challenges are. Right? When a manager makes a decision to let somebody join his team and no one on that team has gotten to know that person, then we're almost asking for surprises. So why not bring them in and at least try and figure out what those are going to be ahead of time? And there are very few, I'm sure you know this, very few personality companies that can actually do something similar by seeing whether or not somebody's a fit with the overall sort of culture and personality of the organization. The ones that work are hugely expensive. The easier thing to do is just the people who work with new hires should be the ones deciding who gets hired.
And testing, well, the Big Five and the MBTI personality does not always make the fit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a whole monologue about MBTI we could go into, but yeah, let's not go there.
What touched me the most in your book is burnout. We are living in a world that's really chaotic, that's really troublesome. And I've seen, as a psychologist, I've seen students burn out. I've seen people in the workplace burning out, teachers burning out, doctors, psychiatrists burning out, It is a big mental health issue. And I'm touched that you touched it, that you even went there, the idea of being exhausted and depersonalization. I mean, I know a lot about burnout because I've seen a lot of burnout, It's terrible. So, David, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's several different employment practices that I think can help with this. In the book, we talk about unlimited vacation done well. We talk about sabbaticals and those sort of things. I think the first thing is this sort of, there's this, and it's a Frederick Taylor factory holdover. There's this assumption that presence equals productivity. Yes. That the fact that someone is at the office means that they are working, and it's quite simply not the case anymore. I mean, you could put as many firewalls and all of that sort of stuff on their computers as possible. They're still going to use their phone when they're burned out and bored out and that sort of thing. Exactly. Right? So that's the biggest shift, is we need to separate that presence from productivity, and then realize, and I said it earlier, that time away from work makes work better. There is not, like, one of my favorite examples, the thing that always gets overlooked. We go back to K. Anders Ericsson in the study of the 10,000 hour rule, which is, not actually as important as Malcolm Gladwell said it is. But even in that study, one of the things that Anders Ericsson noted was that those elite violinists and those elite performers that he kept studying and saying it's around 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, they got more sleep every night than everybody else. They also were more likely to accrue those 10,000 hours in 90-minute bursts and then take long breaks. Like, we're just coming into a realization of this. My friend and colleague and brilliant writer, probably more brilliant than me, Dan Pink, likes to say that the science of breaks is where the science of sleep was 10 years ago. And I think that's the science we need to keep promoting, is that breaks, time away from work, makes work better. Now, that can come in formal sort of things like unlimited vacation and sabbaticals and those sort of things. But I think it also needs to come in like encouragement that, like, it's not cool to eat lunch at your desk. Exactly. It's not even cool to eat lunch at your office. Get out of here. Go take a walk. Go meet up with a friend that works, a couple blocks away. Those sort of things make work better when you get back to it. But we're still in this sort of hustle culture where we think that presence equals productivity, and that the thing to brag about is how many hours you clocked into the office, whether you were working or not.
There was one sentence where you wrote, "Be unproductive." I don't know if you remember writing that. Be unproductive. In other words, bring it down. Temporary. Just bring it down. I see young people like burned out. They have to study and they have to do well because they need the right job, and it's a circle. It's a vicious circle, and people suffer.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's broader things going on with our encouragement towards specialization, our
Yes.
encouragement towards peaking as early as possible. So we're pushing these kids to do that. And then that translates into a culture that like, I think candidly, I think one of the things we as humans have yet to come to terms with is just how long we're actually going to live. You know what I mean? Like you're probably going to live to be 80 to 100 years
Yeah.
old.
Yeah.
And yet we want people to have started their $1 billion company by 25. It's ridiculous. And what you miss out on in all of those years, or even now, you're like, I'm mid 30s and I've got, I'm trying to brag about how little work I do from day to day. Not in a way that seems like, oh, I'm amazing and but like that I know that I've got about 2 90-minute bursts of good work in me. And the rest of the time, I want to hang around my kids. I want to be able to go to the gym so I can be part of that crew that lives to 100. I want to do those things with that amount of time. And I got to make sure I'm getting what I need to get done for the day done. But there's also always going to be lots of mindless, stupid tasks that don't create value, but are that sort of reactive work. Most of those things can wait. I've got about, like I said, I've got about 90-minute focused bursts. I spend some of it writing. I spend some of it doing other creative stuff. And that's about as productive as any of us are going to be in an 8-hour workday.
But you're very cognizant of that. Not everybody is. You mentioned spending time with kids, spending bursts of energy, at a certain twice a day, whatever. Most people don't see that. And also the brain is not fully developed till 25. How could they peak at 25? It doesn't work.
Right. It's not possible. Yeah.
It's not possible. I would say you're an adult by the time you're 30 without offending you. Yeah, that's what happens. Because
yeah, no, I often joke that 30 is like the new 12.
Yes.
Right. Right.
It's true. We had to grow up very quickly. You take your time.
But again, it's also, some of it is also that realization that we're like the idea that, and no offense, like in the United States, and I don't want to make this a political thing, but like Social Security being 65, 67 years old sends a message that that's the time to pull out of the workplace. I know some really healthy 75-year-olds, right? And there are some that are not, and they should pull back or they should scale down or what have you. But again, if you're going to live to be an average of 90 to 100 years old, we need to come to terms with the fact that that's not a 40-year career. That's a much longer career. And hence, what's the rush? What's the rush in achieving and then having anxiety because you're not achieving enough, so you spend even more hours in the workplace, et cetera. And I mean, thankfully, you and I are not the only people sounding this horn. I'm in the middle of reading Rich Cargart's Late Bloomers, which is a great book. After that, I'm planning on reading David Epstein's Range, which is again about generalization versus specialization and not pushing people to be hyper specialized early on. So I think we're getting there. We just need as many voices as we can guiding this discussion.
We also have to bring down this competitive spirit, because I think that's what far more. Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just talking about this in a broader context about high performance cultures. And so often, because we call them that, they turn into intercompetitive cultures where people are competing against each other for who makes partner and that sort of stuff. And in reality, the biggest trait I see of high performance cultures is actually psychological safety. Yes. Leaders letting people know that they can be vulnerable, that they can admit mistakes, that they can ask for help. That creates a high performance company more than a competitive sort of culture. And yet we still think that every company should be like a team, like it should be win or lose. And that's not the case if you're shooting for the long term.
We have to change. We have a few changes to make. So let me ask you, what else, if you had something else to cover in your book, what else would you what would you consider?
Yeah, the way that I wrote the book is I looked at a lot of different modern management practices, and then I had to satisfy a couple different qualities. The first was that I needed to see it in more than just one field. There's a lot of new things that are just in sort of tech, for example, or are just in in one industry, like manufacturing or something like that. That's not relevant to everybody. So I had to see multiple. And like when I saw the unlimited vacation working in a hospital, then I was like, okay, this is an idea that is probably scalable. And then we needed a good body of research behind it. And searching for that research was the hardest part, finding the psychological research that backs up these practices. There were a lot of practices that I couldn't find research for. So based on that, like, it's hard to go, oh, I wish I would have talked about this because I don't know if it would have met those criteria. What I tell a lot of leaders is that the book has a bunch of different practices in it, and it's really easy if you just read it once and you don't sort of chew on it. It's really easy to see those as policies of addition, meaning let's add this practice, let's add this policy. In reality, every single one of them is a policy of subtraction. The story behind how each one of them came to be is that a leader or multiple leaders in one organization or multiple organizations saw this thing, this way we used to do things is blocking our people from doing their best work, and therefore we need to remove it. That could be time, right? Time at the office. We've been talking about burnout, so that's where sabbaticals and paid vacations and those sort of things came from. But it could be a practice like the expense report, which drives everyone nuts. And in reality, only 1 out of 100 people are taking advantage of it. And we should just fire them and not have, it could be whatever it is. So that's my biggest piece of advice. Isn't like, oh, I wish I would have done this practice or whatever. My biggest piece is if you find you can't do any of the practices in the book, that's fine. What you need to do as a leader is go, where are my people, especially my high performing people, complaining? What is bugging them? What is blocking them from doing their best work? And then how can we change it to remove that barrier? That ultimately is one of the most important jobs of a leader, is to figure out what's blocking the path. What are the obstacles that are standing in the way? And sometimes those obstacles are internal. Sometimes they're the way we used to do things, and you've got to have the courage to go, okay, we're going to get rid of that in the service of helping you do your best work.
So maybe your next book could be on the millennials or...
Well, the millennials aren't the problem. They're here, right? It's Gen Z is the one that's coming in. The first round of Gen Z graduates has begun. So that's, and by the way, I'm not really a big fan of the Gen Z name. We get really lazy, and it takes probably 10 years to settle in on a generational name. So we'll call them, if you're watching this like 14 years from now, there'll be some other name for Gen Z, but we'll go with that one.
Thank you so much. This was amazing, amazing. You are a person who doesn't believe in the status quo totally, if I may say. You fight the status quo, and I appreciate that. I really do. I really do, because I think not enough people are kind of like I said, my late father sat down at a machine and knew what he had to do. He stretched the fur. That was the work back then, you know? And it's very sad. And all he knew was come home and give my mother her little budget, whatever. And very sad. And you brought me back to those times. I haven't thought about it in a while, but you brought me back there, you know? Frederick Taylor stuff. Thank you so much. I wish.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, are you kidding? I appreciate you. I do. Keep on doing the great work. And I love the fact that you have a book, a discussion book, a guidance book that goes with that, which I printed, and you have some great questions to ask in there.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it's not about, of course I want to sell as many books as possible. Yeah. What I care more is as many conversations going on in the workplace after as possible. So yeah.
I knew you were going to say that, because your book lends itself to conversations in so many different arenas. And I thank you. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Again, thank you so much for having me.
Be well. Have a good vacation. Whatever you're doing in the summer. The weather, forget it. But I live in Canada. You don't, you know. Rain, and more. Thank you, David. Be well. Enjoy your family, right?
Oh, thank you. Yep. Thank you.
Take care. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. You too.